Hi, welcome to the Semiotic Eye, a podcast where you get to learn about all things semiotics. The following episodes will include conversations between Hamsini Shivkumar, India's leading semiotician and founder of Leapfrog Strategy Consulting, and Anurag Vaish, the founder of Mensa, a social media platform for audio sharing. The live audience listening to the conversations were allowed to interject and ask questions. Unfortunately, you won't be able to do the same here. However, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us on Leapfrog Strategy Consulting on LinkedIn. We hope this podcast is insightful to you and deepens your understanding of semiotics.
So in today's session, I want to talk about where is the meeting ground between science, as in SIGNS, science, behavior and behavioral science. And, in sort of thinking about it, I've made a binary or a point that, how to theorize the meeting ground between science and behavioral science. And my view is there is a core binary to consider in this, and that is the one between open spaces, open systems, and enclosed spaces and closed systems. Because the semiotics of enclosed spaces or closed environments and open environments is entirely different when you consider the intended impact on human behavior or behavior change. And I'll elaborate on this through the course of today's talk. So let's start by looking at closed environments that we encounter in everyday life, right? So in urban environments, these are plenty. You think of roads, think of airports, think of metro stations, train stations, office building, office spaces, even the interiors or insides of homes, right? These environments are closed, as in when somebody enters the space and then what they are allowed to do within that space and how they exit that space. People don't have 100% unlimited freedom in how they negotiate the space and in the way they interface with people and objects within the space. So an airport probably is the most extreme example of closure, because how you enter and exit an airport is also designed and you are taken in. So nowadays it's become standardized or normative in airports around the world that where is the departure level and arrival level, right? So the departure level is placed on an elevation and the arrival level is placed on the ground level. And the bridges or the roadways are built that will take you up to the departure level. And then, when you are coming down. So, and then from when your entry onwards, your behavior is controlled by the airport management or airport management, basically. So how you enter, then once you enter, where you go, what you do, the steps you follow, the sequence within, everything is controlled. It's designed, it's controlled, there's a certain path and you cannot deviate from that path without consequences and punishments, right? Like once you enter the airport, you cannot exit easily. So that is, these closed environments therefore work on a conceptual model of compliance by users. It's not really much of a choice of users. So there, in these closed environments, there are rule makers and rule takers, right? And users of that space are rule takers to a large extent. And the degrees of freedom for users to deviate from the set path and make their own choices is very limited. Some differences, of course, from place to place. So, for example, airports give you less freedom to deviate than railway stations, for instance. And of course, in designing these spaces and the rules of navigation within that space, the more authoritarian the attitude of the rule makers, the less they care about the viewpoints of users. But the more democratic and egalitarian the attitude of rule makers, more importance is given to the needs and viewpoints of users in the design of the space as well as the design of the rules of compliance. So therefore, the role and use of signs in closed environments, it calls for a different type of meeting ground between semiotics and behavioral science, than when open environments are being discussed. Even in the digital space, in e-commerce sites, for example, as long as the shopper is browsing, they operate in a relatively open environment because they can follow any path they want through the website and they can jump off also whenever they like. However, once they are on the purchase path, their options are more limited and they have to complete the set path in the same sequence as laid out by the company. Then if they want to close the sale, they have to follow that path. They can't do jump steps, and go from some one to the last step. They have to go through the steps as laid out by the site design, and then only they can reach the end point, which is the purchase of whatever they are seeking to purchase. So now within closed environments, enabling spatial and object navigation is actually the primary goal of sign construction, right? So once you have to read, so all these closed spaces, especially closed public spaces such as airports and railway stations or metro stations, for example, they are all designed with the combination of signs, right? So they use both visual and verbal signs for navigation, and we can call verbal signs is also instructions and announcements that you constantly hear, which will keep repeating both the desired actions and the prohibited actions, right? So if you go on the Delhi metro, constantly there'll be announcements which say that you are not supposed to throw garbage here, the mind the gap between the train and the platform, and many other such not written, but spoken verbal signs and announcements, etc., etc. So you are actually constantly not just being guided through by way of the system design in terms of barriers, barricades, ticket places, etc., etc., but also by the constant amount of instruction that you are getting from the environment in terms of desired behavior. And then there are also the interfaces between the users and service providers or officials in order to interact and communicate with one another, right? So here, since the outbreak of COVID, these interfaces were altered by bringing in the transparent glass or plastic barrier. And that barrier basically changed the meaning of the interaction from the way it was earlier, from being open and free to becoming much more contained and fearful. So what is the role of semiotics in this, and working with a behavioral scientist in the design of these enclosed spaces? Basically, a knowledge of semiotics brings to the discussion and solution development a deeper understanding of semiosis, or how signs work. So in the previous two sessions, I spoke about Peirce and his whole approach to understanding semiosis, how sign interpretation takes place, how signs work, and hence how they can be effective or ineffective, right? So ineffective signs basically are waste of time, money, and effort, and they can also create further problems. So I'll just talk about how signs can become ineffective or fail. And they can do so in multiple ways. We don't think about it too much because we just take it for granted. But from a system designer point of view, sign failure can something that they would like to avoid and actually have more effective signs. So the very first type of sign failure is when there is lack of attention, right? Signs can be overlooked, not noticed, hence not attended to. So when users don't pay attention to or ignore the signs, then they can misbehave or they can make mistakes, they can create problems for all the other users of that space. Of course, the common sense solution to the problem is often to become more intrusive, right? So the lights start flashing, the barriers and blockages become bigger, the signages become huge, you have louder voices, more aggressive voice tonalities, more instructive voice tonality, etc. Of course, the problem with this solution is that it makes user experience of the space much more unpleasant and negative. Whereas if you had a team of semioticians, behavioral scientists, and designers, you can help to find more creative, more engaging, and positive solutions to this problem of lack of attention. The second is, yes, I might notice the sign, but I may not comprehend or understand the sign because I don't know the language. So that's why you have multiple languages. And then if you know you're going to have a lot of users who are largely illiterate, then you really need to think much more visually than verbally, because written things, they can't read and understand what is written. They operate at least visually. So you would focus much more on signs based on iconicity, which people can just match and recognize. And that to more primary iconicity, where it's really like a photo or a visual that they can easily match mentally with familiar things. Even more secondary iconicity, sophisticated drawing, going into outlines and expecting people to comprehend it, etc., may not really work. So this lack of comprehension means that you'll have to have a complete redesign of the signs, keeping in mind two things: the prior learning and habits of users. So semioticians can actually point out all these potential pitfalls prior to user testing, because they're trained for attention to small details that are easily overlooked. And if you know semiotics, you can also provide some possible alternative routes or platforms for sign construction based on culturally relevant material to the design team. The third kind of problem that can happen is if there is a poor synthesis of modes, right? Multimodality, whereas when signs in multiple modes are combined together, there are visual icons, there are written messages, and then audio instructions. So how well do these come together to create a unified whole that is meaningful to users? Or, are all of these pulling in different directions, such as there is incoherence and the desired impact on user behavior doesn't really take place? So that's another type of sort of sign breakdown problem. Lastly, you can also have risk of being misunderstood or negatively interpreted. So sometimes visual similarity of signs to culturally taboo or difficult topics, issues with the use of words and expressions and all, can also trip up the creators and owners. And these risks have risen significantly after the mainstreaming of social media. So these are all the ways in which there can be sign failure or failure of semiosis, and that then can make the use of signs in a closed environment much less effective than it could possibly be. Going further, obviously, then one could think, therefore, if we are thinking about signs, can we have some kind of handy reference guide that, which are classification systems and sign typologies, etc., which are helpful to sign creators? So here what I found is, since there are millions and millions of signs in the world, right? So they can be classified in so many different ways. So of course, a very basic one is in terms of their form and mode of existence. So are they visual? Are they verbal? Are they auditory? Are they written? In that way, what is their mode of existence? You can classify them. Last time, I spoke about Peirce in the last two sessions. So Peirce actually developed a very elaborate classification system of 66 classes of signs. So his classification was based on how semiosis takes place. So this how signs represent objects and the logic through which signs are interpreted. However, in practice, this very elaborate sign typology is almost never used by anyone because it's just too cumbersome. I just know a lot of academic semiotics who are deeply dedicated Peirceans, who have spent hours and hours trying to sort of develop the 66 classes and make models around it and so on and so on. But among practitioners, I've never found anyone who uses the 66 classes of Peircean signs. It's just too complex. From a behavioral standpoint, possibly a simple 4-level classification of signs is useful, which I use. So I think about signs as pictograms, which work at a precognitive level through simple matching of visual elements. Most of these, your visual icons used in public spaces actually work in this way when you think of them as navigation aids. So the user does not pause, think, process the sign. They can just match at speed due to past learning and habit formation. So navigating the space becomes smooth and easy, and there is less scope for confusion or errors. Then signs can also be perceptograms and sensograms. These fill in more details and evoke sensory effects through visual treatment. So you process them cognitively to comprehend them, to use them for navigation or interface. For example, in the Delhi airport, all the washroom entrances use a big color photograph of an elaborately dressed man or woman, right? That kind of a sign is a perceptogram because it gives you a lot of detail to feed your perception. The most sophisticated type of sign is the ideogram. The ideogram relies on cultural symbolism and symbolic layering to actually evoke emotions and convey information, etc. But ideograms are mostly used in advertising campaigns or creative material. They are not used when the goal is to aid smooth navigation or interface because they require more thought, and there's also more room for alternative interpretations, which is what you don't want when you're trying to have the smooth navigation and interface through any kind of closed environment. Now, when you think about closed environments and you think about your house or home and how you navigate the spaces in your home, even that, while it may not be rules like the airport's rules with whatever, but culturally you are taught where and how you are supposed to navigate the space within your home, right? Like in all our homes, we don't wear outside slippers inside. So there is a space where you should be, and then you are supposed to walk barefoot or wear a certain kind of footwear when you walk inside the home. There are things that you can place next to each other and not next to each other, so all these are sort of cultural rules that define how even living spaces are to be used and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And these are taught to you and you are habituated to it, so you don't think about it and you just do it in autopilot. But if anybody breaks the rule, then immediately you do come to know that, oh, okay, actually, yes, this rule did exist or does exist, and we better not break that rule. So for example, in Western cultures, people are taught from a very young age that they have their own room and they close the door on the room and they stay in private. Whereas in India, we are used to living in more open spaces, and that is how you are supposed to live. So yes, the room may have a door, but you're not expected to keep the door shut all the time. The default is that it is kept open, and then when required, the door may be shut. So it's a different mental model of how you are to live within a space and use objects within the space, for example. So when you think about that object as a sign and what it represents and how it is encoded into behavior, how you are taught, etc., all these things come into the picture when you're designing spaces and you're thinking about the signs that you use for instructive purposes, but also the objects, the barriers, things that are placed within that space, and how that therefore that constrains people's behavior and directs it in specific ways and away from certain types of behaviors and directs it away. So that's really how you sort of think about signs and behavior in closed spaces. I'll stop here and take questions and comments, please.
Yeah. It could be in a familiar space or it could be in an alien space, right?
Yeah.
And in a familiar space, you typically, so, there is this predicting self and there is this perceiving self, right? So, and the two is always in competition, right? The moment you see any signal, any sign, any instruction, right? There's a perception system that gets activated, but equally there's a prediction system also that gets activated very, very quickly, right? And apparently for every one fiber that goes into perception from bottom to top, there are 10 fibers floating down from the top to the bottom to predict something, right? So in alien spaces, then human brains allow for more perception, right?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And in familiar spaces is the prediction field where you kind of, quickly try to make sense of a sign because your prediction system is very, very strong, right? And
yes, that's where the effect of that learning and habit, autopilot, all these things come in the familiar spaces and your prediction, right? That's how your prediction is accurate.
Yes. And that's where I think from a design point of view, right, it becomes a tool in the hand of the designer, right, to create a sense or not create a sense of alienness, right? So if you want to change people's behavior, it's better to kind of use a little bit of unfamiliarity.
Surprise. Yeah, surprise,
Yeah.
unfamiliarity. Yeah.
Right?
Yes,
So
you're
that's what
100% right. No, I agree with you. So it is really up to when the team sits down to design, they really need to think about what is that behavior you want, and is that behavior already familiar and habituated, or actually I'm trying to create a change. By habit, people will turn left, but I have to make them turn right. So to make them turn right, I have to bring some element of surprise, which will make them pause, think. So between that perception and the prediction, yeah, I have to bring that pause at that point.
Exactly, right. And when a lot of it is just environment design, right? And not necessarily the design of the sign that you want, right? So if you design the environment, like, once we were trying to do some work on trespassing, not trespassing by feet, but, the spies who kind of try to run through the signal, right? On a railway crossing.
Yeah.
So one of the things they did was to create, this, what do you call that, road breaker, right? Speed breaker.
Yeah.
Familiar. People know speed breakers
Yes.
are familiar, right? So what we did was we made a slanted speed breaker, right? So it's like an angle, set a straight horizontal one, right? That little unfamiliarity, right, brings a lot of attention for you to kind of perceive the symbols a little bottom up rather than top down, right? So whenever you want to, bottom up processing to happen because the heuristic may not be good, you can create a little bit of unfamiliarity in the environment, and then the processing of the symbols change dramatically.
Yes, 100% true. That is how it works. So it is, I like this classification of familiar, unfamiliar. So therefore the surprise is what gets attention, and then things sort of work thereafter. And that's what actually at another level, we think creatively, one of the biggest things that creative people do is to bring that element of surprise into whatever they are designing, so that the audience is taken out of that at an extreme zombie zone to sort of okay, and then you kind of you hit the attention aspect, you hit hard on attention by bringing that surprise. So yes, I completely agree, and this is a great sort of intersection point, I would say. Super. Yeah, thank you all. Bye.
Thank you for listening to The Semiotic Eye. Please stay tuned for more episodes of this podcast. And if you want to learn more about semiotics, please go to our website, leapfrogstrategy.com, and access our learning center to start your semiotic journey. Bye.